All right, I'm going to apologize. I kind of explained this in class, but I'm going to apologize that this isn't on the exact same sheet you got passed out. It won't let me, on my Google Docs, it won't let me project it into Notability, so I had to put it on a PowerPoint. So this isn't the exact same, but if you take out the bright pink paper, I'm gonna get that on my screen here so that I can make sure that I'm not teaching anybody wrong. But this has been like a 30-minute process, and I am finally throwing the towel in, and you should have the bright pink piece of paper out, and the only difference is on the top left hand, it says y equals 3. Okay, and I think I did that just because. Okay, the name isn't up at the top, but I would label this because you're gonna have to name these functions in your homework. And this function is called a constant function because if you notice, there's no variables. Anywhere at all, it's just y equals 3. Okay, so this is a little bit, you have a table on yours. I'm gonna just copy this because this is gonna be a pain all day. But I'm gonna copy this table here and we'll drop it in my next slide. Okay, so I can put in any values I want. So like I could put in a -2, -1, 0, 1, 2. And if I put a -2 in for x, well, there isn't even an x. Oops, edit, delete. Okay, there isn't even an x. So isn't my y value just gonna stay a constant? 3. Okay, so my y line would be back 2, up 3, back 1, up 3, 0, 3, 1, 3, 2, 3, 3, 3, 4, 3. And this thing, oops, let's try to make a straight line. This thing would be a horizontal line at 3. And it's called a constant function by the equation because there is no x value. And it's called a constant function by the graph because it's a horizontal line. Now I'm going to teach you domain and range, and we're gonna work on this the next couple of days. Domain and range is what your x values can be. So like I could have kept going, 3, 4, 5. I could have put in 117. I could have put in 1/2. I could put in fractions, decimals, negatives, positives. So this is all numbers, but I'm going to teach you the correct way to write that in set notation because you're gonna need set notation. The correct way to write this is a -infinity to infinity. So, and you use parentheses because you really don't know what infinity is. Like if I ask you, tell me the biggest number you know, I could always say one more. Like there isn't a value for the biggest number, so we put parentheses because it's going on forever. Okay, that is set notation, and you're always gonna use parentheses on infinity. Okay, if you try to use a bracket, I will take off. Okay, your range, so your domain, I'm just gonna kind of highlight this so you can see. Your domain is what your x values can be. And this should be a review for you, okay? Your range is what your y values can be. Well, look at your table. Isn't your range 3? So I'm going to show you set notation. You're gonna use a bracket, and you're gonna say 3, and you're gonna use a bracket. That means equal. Set notation, you're saying that your y values equal 3. So when you're doing range, you're looking at your y values. Your y value is 3, the entire table, so that is your range, okay? Now, these are the parent functions that are gonna be on your final. Remember I said you're gonna have 8 graphing questions and no calculator on your final. These are all the parent functions we're doing this semester. On this pink bright sheet of paper, this is like your postulate packet in geometry. Like that's why I put it on cardstock. You do not want to lose this paper. This has all of the functions. So the first one we're reviewing is what's called a constant, okay? So the next one is a parent function, and the parent function is a line. So they call it a linear function. On this test, I'm going to ask you to name functions. And if it has an x in it, then it is a linear function. If it does not have an x, then it's a horizontal line and it's a constant function. So you're gonna have to know the names. There is only, if you look at this pink paper, this is for all of the semester. On this test, there are only 4 functions that are on this test. So constant, linear, okay? I would like you to take a minute, and I would like you to do your table of values, okay? I want you to plug in some X's, I want you to plug in some Y's, and I would like you to sketch the graph. I would like you to pause your computer, pause please, and I would like you to do what we did up here where you make a table, you sketch the graph, and see if you can figure out the domain and the range. Go. Pause the video. Okay, so you should have paused. I can put in whatever I want, -2, 1, 0, 1, 2. So if I put a -2 in for X, wouldn't my Y be a -2? If I put a -1 in, my Y is a -1, 0, 0, 1, and 2. So this line goes 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4. It also goes -1, -1, -2, -2. And it is a linear line through here. Okay. So if I look, let's go back to just our domain and our range. If I look at my domain is X values. Can you put anything in for X? Can you put in positives? Can you put in negatives? Can you put in decimals? Yes, you can. So the domain is all real numbers. So we're going to write that by saying -infinity to infinity. We are going to practice set notation. Okay, all real numbers is not a wrong answer, but I'm asking you to do things in set notation. Okay, so now, when you're looking at your domain, you're looking at your X values. When we're looking at Y's, we're looking at our domain range, excuse me. Oh my gosh. If we're looking at range, we're looking at Y values, right? So if we look at this function, doesn't it go from the bottom to top? These arrows are going down and this arrow is going up. So isn't it, no matter what you put in for the domain, is going to be the range? So my range is a -infinity to infinity. Okay, my infinity signs are yucky. I apologize. To get this iPad to work, I have to have it in the upright position. So sometimes my writing gets a little sloppy, and it does anyway. Okay, so that one will be on the test. You're going to have to be able to name it by the equation, and that would have an X in it. You're going to have to be able to describe it like it is a line that has a slope. It's not a flat line. It's not a vertical line. Okay, all right. The next parent function is the one we've been talking about the last couple of days. Okay, the next parent function is an absolute value function. Okay, so if we think about the absolute value function, we can tell it's an absolute value function by the equation because the equation has an absolute value sign. So if it has an absolute value sign, then it is an absolute value function. Very easy. Math people aren't very creative. Okay, so just like on the last one, you're going to understand this better if you take 3 or 4 minutes and come up with it on your own. But I would like you to pause the video and put in a couple numbers and see if you can get what the graph looks like and see if you can get the domain and the range. You have an eraser. You can fix it if you're wrong. Pause. So I'm just going to do -1 or -2, -1, 0, 1, 2. So if I put those X's in here, what's the absolute value of a -2? Well, it's 2. What's the absolute value of a -1 is 1. Absolute value of 0 is 0, 1 is 1, 2 is 2, 3 is 3. So wouldn't I have a function that goes like this, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, -1, 1, -2, 2, -3, 3. So it actually looks like a V. That's the best way to describe this. It looks like, oops, there we go. It looks like a V. Okay, and so this is the parent function. How can you tell it's a parent function? By the equation it's an absolute value because it has an absolute value sign. How can you tell by the graph? Because it's a V. It has the same slope, up 1 over 1, up 1 over 1, up 1 over 1. It doesn't change the slope. Okay, so now let's take a look at our X values. When I think about what I can put into this function, can I put everything into this function? I can put in negatives, I can put in positives, I can put in 0, I can put in decimals, fractions. Yep. So this is going to be a really good guess on the first test. If I ask you for the domain, so far we've had 3 of the 4 functions, and all of their domains are -infinity to infinity. So if you don't know the answer, I'd slap that on the first test, okay, because everything works. But now we're going to look at the range. Okay, the range is your Y values. And if you look at this, my lowest Y value is at 0. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just define this point. Isn't this point right here 0, 0? So when I define that point at 0, 0, so that's the lowest it can ever be. So my range, and it can be 0, right? When I took the absolute value of 0, I got 0. So we're going to use a bracket, and we're going to say 0 to infinity with parentheses. Why do we use parentheses with the infinity? Because you can't tell me what infinity means. Infinity is the biggest number you can think of. Well, if you think of the biggest number you think of, I could think of one more. So you can't tell me what the biggest number you can think of is because I could always make it bigger, okay? So this is the third function that we're going to do on this first test, is an absolute value. Okay, the next function, this is where this gets tricky, so please listen because I am trying to make sure you understand. The function is called quadratic. It's called quadratic because you have a square in it. So that is why they call it quadratic. Okay, it's called quadratic because it has a square in it. The graph is not called a quadratic. The graph is actually called a parabola. So I'm going to write that over here. The graph, and these are your notes, so you can write whatever you want them, is called a parabola. So if I ask you to name the function and you say parabola, I will take off. The name of the function is quadratic. The graph is called a parabola. I know that's really picky and you don't know me very well yet, but I will tell you that if I'm picky about something, it's because you do really need to understand it for your future. And then sometimes I'm not picky about things and I'm like, it doesn't matter. And those are the things that don't matter, but you do need to know the difference. The function itself is called a quadratic. So if I ask you to name the function, you're going to say quadratic. The graph is called a parabola. So on a test, I might say graph the parabola. Well, that means I want you to graph the parabola, okay? So take a second. You got this down now. I want you to pause and I want you to put in some numbers for X and some numbers for Y, and then we'll see what happens. Pause. So if I square -2, I get 4, 1, 0, 1, 4. I'm going to go ahead and do 3. 3 is at 9, and a -3 is at a +9, right? So if I graph this, it's not. So it's 0, 0, 1, 1, 2 is at 4, 3 is at 9. This thing is not, oh, that's not good. This thing is not linear. This thing curves, okay? 2 is at 4, 3 is at 9, so it curves up. The picture, that graph is called a parabola. It's kind of U-shaped because depending on how fast it's growing and its dilation, which we're going to talk about, it might look skinnier or wider than that, but it definitely is not a V. It's not at a constant. It's getting bigger, okay? So if we, again, look at the X's and we think about what our domain is, our domain is what you can put into square. Can't you square everything? You can square negatives, you can square positives, you can square decimals, fractions, everything. So this is really nice. Hopefully you're hearing me. On this test, what is the answer on every domain on this test? This first test is over quadratics, -infinity to infinity. Absolute values, -infinity to infinity. Linears, -infinity to infinity, and constants, -infinity to infinity. So you should not miss that. Like you should not get a 0 on this test because you can put everything into these functions. But on this next part, if you look at your y's, the smallest y is right here at 0, 0. So my range is my y values. It's never going to go negative because when you square a negative number, it becomes positive. So your range is going to be 0, and it's a bracket because when you square 0, you get 0 for an answer. It's 0 to infinity with the parentheses. Okay? All right. So these are what is on the first 4 tests. The first test, sorry, not first 4 tests. The first 4 functions are what is on the first test. I do want to take a look at just a couple more. These aren't on the first test, but I kind of want to get your brain just kind of moving a little bit. It doesn't hurt to talk. We're not going to do all of them, but we're going to do a couple of them. Okay, so the next parent function that we're going to do after we're going to spend a lot of time on quadratics. That's next chapter. And then after we're going to do what's called polynomials. So this is a special polynomial. It's called a cubic function because my exponent is cubed. Okay, so I would like you to put in some X's and Y's and just give me what your answer would be, please. And sketch a graph. Pause. Okay, negative 2 cubed is actually a negative 8. Negative 1 cubed is a negative 1, 0, 1, 8. So if I do a negative 2, negative 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1 cubed, negative 1 cubed is a negative 1, 0, 1, 8. Okay, so it kind of goes like down because it would be a negative 3 cubed would be, 27, negative 27. So it's going to continue down very quickly. So if we look at the domain, okay, the domain is my x's. Can I cube positives? Yes. Negatives? Yes. Decimals, fractions, zeros? Yes. I can cube everything. So if I can cube everything, my domain is a negative infinity to infinity. So there was some, I don't know if you would call it cheating on the Algebra 2 final, but there was somebody sitting next to somebody else, and it was coming down to the end of the final, and I heard it really clearly. But one of the students said to another student, at least write a negative infinity to infinity. Like, honestly, 80% of the time, it's going to be the right answer because you can put everything in. Now, check this out. If you look at your y's, if you cube a negative, you're going to get a negative. If you cube a positive, you're going to get a positive. If you cube 0, you're going to get 0. If you cube a half, you're going to get an eighth. Like, you're going to get fractions. You're going to get decimals. It's going on forever up and down. So guess what? Your range is also a negative infinity to infinity. And that's kind of what my one student was saying to the other. Like, seriously, just write down a negative infinity to infinity. You might get the right answer. Okay, so this is a cubic function. All right, the next function is what's called the square root function. And if you use a tad bit of common sense, you can see why it's called the square root function because it has a square root in it, right? And we're not going to do this whole thing, but I would like you to put in some x's and y's. Whoa, edit undo that. Sorry, I wish that I could get out. It's just being a pain, and I'm not going to mess with it anymore. So, square root function. I would like you to take a minute and see if you can figure this one out. Plug some numbers in and see what happens. I would like you to pause, and I would like you to plug some numbers in, and I would like you to see what happens. Go. Okay. If I plug if I plug a negative 2 in, I can't even square root a negative 2. It doesn't work, right? You can't square root negative numbers. Try it on your calculator, depending on what you're set in, because these are algebra. So be careful with that. There's nothing times itself that's going to give you negative. You can't square root a negative 1, but you can square root 0. The square root of 0 is 0. And you can square root 1. The square root of 1 is 1. And you can square root 2, but I don't know what that is without a calculator, and I don't have a calculator, so I'm going to put in 4. I can square root 4 because the square root of 4 is 2, but I could have square rooted in between there. I just didn't have a calculator. What would be my next nice one? Would be 9. So I'm going to square root 9, and I get 3. So if I look at this thing, it definitely is not all real numbers because I couldn't do negatives. So if I look at my x values, right? If I look at where this x is right here, this point is at 0, 0. My first x is at 0. So my domain is 0 to infinity. So here is our first function, function 6, where your domain is not negative infinity to infinity because you can't square root negative numbers. And then I'm going to look at my range. It does not go on forever. If I look at my range, it can't be those, it starts right here, right? I can't put in those numbers. So it starts right there at 0. So my range is also 0 to infinity. All right. So this is the pink parent function packet. We're going to do the backside. We'll do the cube root and exponential and rational later. I just don't want to make it hard to understand, so I'll do those when we get back. They aren't on the chapter. The only chapter test questions are constants, linears, absolute values, and quadratics. Okay, not even square root is on this test. All right, so just for the sake of uploading these videos, I am going to stop this one, and then you need to take out your purple sheet, and we're going to do the purple sheet on the next video.